All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another session of public budgeting. Hope everyone is doing well and your week is off to a good start. Tonight, we have one topic left to cover, and then we are done with all of our substantive information for the semester. So I don't anticipate tonight's course being class session being very long. I think we'll probably be done within an hour and a half pretty easily. But just as a reminder, before we get into our final topic of intergovernmental fiscal relations, reminder, you only have 2 assignments left in the class. You have Beach Board Essay number 5, and in Beach Board Essay number 5, you'll be looking at the city that you use as a topic for your pre and post instructional assignments, and you'll be looking at the tax structure that that city is using. And you'll give me an analysis of that tax structure, how progressive or how regressive the tax structure appears to you, again, using the information that we discussed when we did tax evaluative criteria. And then after you assess the progressivity or regressivity of the tax, is there a different type of tax that you would recommend the city use, or is there a different type of revenue structure that you think the city should be using to, again, make it more progressive in nature? So you'll be analyzing the tax structure used by your city, and that will then be your final, 5th and final Beach Board essay. So that is then due next Monday by midnight. And then next Tuesday by midnight, you have your final assessment. And last week, we had spent time going through all the different scenarios on the final assessment. So once we finish up intergovernmental fiscal relations tonight, you've obviously got all the information you need in order to do the 5 scenarios on the final assessment. And that final assessment then is due next Tuesday by midnight. So you have another week to work on that. That's why I thought for next week, rather than doing a live Zoom session, I'll just give you that time to work on putting the finishing touches on your final assessment. I will be available during this period of time between 4 and 6 or so. If you have any questions, email me and I can respond to any questions you may have about the final assessment. But otherwise, rather than have a live session, we'll just afford you extra time to finish up the final assessment and wrap that up. And then we will be done next Tuesday, and then I'll get your final grades all calculated and hopefully have your final grades uploaded within 1 to 2 days after the end of our class. So probably by, the 12th or 13th next week, I should have your final grades all ready to go. Just be advised that sometimes the university is a little bit slow in catching up with the fact that we have hybrid courses. And so sometimes they don't open the grading roster right away. And so if the grading roster is not open by next Wednesday or Thursday, I'll prompt them to open it to make sure we can get your final grades up and recorded. And then you can move onward and upward. If you happen to have a second half hybrid course, you can then focus on that. Your post-instructional assignments, I've gone through those and I provided feedback on those. I think everyone did a very nice job on that. I was really impressed with your use of the fiscal solvency indicators in part 1 of the post-instructional assignment. So thank you for selecting 2 or 3 of those indicators and calculating those, whether you use Brown's indicators or Wang, Dennis, and Tu's indicators. I think you did a really nice job with that. The spreadsheets all look good, and I gave you some feedback. If I thought there's anything that needed to be changed in the spreadsheet, I gave you that as feedback. But for the most part, I think everyone's calculations look good. There are no head librarian positions, and so that's a very good sign. I think you standardize all the salaries well. You reduce the spending down to the target that you needed to, the $2,929,000 target. And so I think that looked very good. For those of you who use the comment feature to include justifications in your spreadsheet, I opened up and read all those comments. For those of you who submitted a separate Word file, I went through and looked at your justifications as well. I thought all the justifications were practical and very reasonable in nature. You adhere to the parameters in Form 56. And so I think overall, everyone did a nice job on part 2 of the post-instructional. So it kind of accomplishes one of those course learning objectives we had when we started out the course together, the ability to analyze and to put together a simple budget format. And that's exactly what you did then with this post-instructional assignment. So I think that's all the housekeeping we have. So as a reminder, Beach Board number 5 is due on Monday, and then your final assessment due by midnight next Tuesday. And then again, we won't have a live Zoom session next week. We'll just give you that time to put the finishing touches on your final assessment. All righty? Okay, let's go ahead and jump into our final topic for the course, and that's intergovernmental fiscal relations. And just as a reminder, if you're interested in any of this information we're covering tonight, we do offer an elective course in the program, PPA 535 Intergovernmental Relations. That course is only offered in the summer. It's usually offered in summer session 1. So it's a 6-week course. It's offered in an asynchronous modality, and so you don't have to attend any class sessions. Everything is provided for you online. You can work on the assignments. We basically have weekly modules in that class. You can complete the weekly modules at your leisure. So it gives you a lot of flexibility over the summer to complete that course. So that is 535 Intergovernmental Relations. And we'll get into a lot of the topics we're going to talk about tonight. We'll get into those more in depth because there's one module of the class that looks only at intergovernmental fiscal relations. And so if you're interested in this information, I strongly recommend taking the 535 Intergovernmental Relations course. Okay, so as we've talked about several times throughout this semester, it really is in the best interest of a local government to have the most diverse revenue portfolio that they can possibly muster. John Mikesell, the author of our book, makes the argument in one of his other books called City Finances, City Futures, that one of the best ways for a city to insulate itself from economic fluctuations in its environment is to maintain a very healthy revenue portfolio diversity. Rely upon a multitude of different revenue sources. And the more revenue sources you can rely upon, the better insulated you will be if one sector of the economy starts having trouble. And so if the housing sector starts having trouble, if you're not overly reliant upon property taxes, then you'll be able to weather that very easily. If you're too reliant upon local option sales taxes, Burns-Bradley Amendment sales taxes, you could get burned if you have a very poorly functioning economy, less disposable income out there, people will be making fewer purchases, and you'll have a decline in your sales tax revenue. However, if you really are able to split up your revenue sources and have a lot of diversity in your revenue portfolio, again, it will help you weather some of those poor economic times. So one way in which cities can diversify their revenue portfolio is through intergovernmental grants and aid, either intergovernmental grants from the national government or intergovernmental grants from the state government. Now, one of our fiscal solvency indicators, and some of you use this indicator in the post-instructional assignment, is to look at the percentage of total revenue that is coming from intergovernmental aid. Because the problem with intergovernmental aid is that sometimes it's very transient in nature, in that we get the grant this year, we don't know if we're going to get the grant in future years. So we tend not to become overly reliant on intergovernmental fiscal revenue, but we also try to incorporate it to enhance the diversity of our revenue portfolio. There's a very famous theory in public budgeting called the flypaper effect. And that comes to us from an author by the name of James Fawcett. And in the flypaper effect, James Fawcett makes the argument that intergovernmental aid tends to stick where it hits. That's why it's called the flypaper effect. In that whenever a city receives this intergovernmental revenue, chances are they're not going to reduce their own source revenue because of this new intergovernmental revenue, because they know this intergovernmental revenue may go away in the future. So whatever the federal government wants them to fund with this federal grant and aid, they're going to fund that specific type of expenditure rather than supplanting some of their other own source revenue because of the instability of intergovernmental revenue. So it does kind of stick where it hits, but it is a good supplement to your revenue portfolio diversity. So as we talk about intergovernmental fiscal revenue, there are three main concepts that we need to be aware of. The first concept in intergovernmental fiscal relations is this concept known as the correspondence principle. Sometimes it's referred to as the fiscal correspondence principle. In the correspondence principle, this principle argues that those governments that are affected by a decision should be involved in that decision-making process. So, for instance, if there's a decision to be made that will end up costing a city money, that city should be involved in that decision-making process. It shouldn't be a decision made in Washington, D.C. or made in Sacramento and then handed down to the city. The city should have a seat at the decision-making table. So the fiscal correspondence principle really argues for a lot of decentralization, decision-making to include local governments in the decision-making process. The second intergovernmental fiscal relations principle is this term known as subsidiarity. Subsidiarity says that if you have a parent government, so if you have the national government telling a state or local government that they need to take a certain type of action, that the national government, it's incumbent upon the national government to provide the resources to allow the state or local government to take that action. Subsidiarity speaks to the requirement on the part of the national government to provide adequate resources to state and local governments. So the subsidiarity principle, which we routinely violate here in our system of American federalism, the subsidiarity principle, again, argues for decentralization. The correspondence principle argues for decentralization in decision-making. The subsidiarity principle argues for decentralization in our funding mechanisms. Now, the problem here, again, in our system of American federalism, is we do a very poor job with subsidiarity. We don't have the only system of federalism in the world. There are a lot of other nations that also have systems of federalism. Australia has a system of federalism. Nigeria has a system of federalism. Federalism is out there in other manifestations in other countries. But some of the other countries that use federalism sometimes adhere to the subsidiarity principle better than we do here in this country. The example of Australia is a great one, in that in Australia, their system of Australian federalism, the national government, when it requires a subnational government, a regional government to do something, it provides the adequate resources for that regional government to take that action. Unfortunately, here in the US, we do a lot of these unfunded or partially funded mandates. Unfunded and partially funded mandates will violate this subsidiarity principle because it's an example of a parent government, for instance, the national government, telling a state or local government to do something and not giving them the adequate resources to do it. So subsidiarity says give the resources to carry out those decisions that are being made. So the correspondence principle speaks to decentralization of decision-making. The subsidiarity principle of federalism speaks to devolution of power and resources. And the difference between decentralization and devolution is in decentralization, we allow subnational governments to be involved in decision-making. In devolution, we provide the resources for them to carry out those decisions that they are participating in and that they are making. So with both correspondence and decentralization and subsidiarity and devolution, we are looking at moving resources and decision-making out of Washington, D.C., down to the state and local government, or out of Sacramento down to local cities and local counties. Then there's a third principle that argues in the opposite direction with federalism. And that third principle is economies of scale. And in your undergraduate course in economics, you probably talked a lot about economies of scale. Economies of scale is just if we do things together, if we buy things in bulk and buy things in volume, we'll get a better deal and we'll save money. So with economies of scale, you're talking about doing things at the larger level of government. So having the federal government, the national government do it, rather than allowing all these individual local governments to go out there and do it on their own. Because if the national government does it, it will be buying it in bulk in a bigger volume and will get a better deal than if you have all these individual cities trying to compete against each other for the best deals. One example of economies of scale that we see a lot in public budgeting is when it comes to things such as insuring bonds. Now, we talked about the different types of bonds. We talked about one of the things that cities try to do is they try to enhance their bond rating so that they can get the lowest coupon rate possible. We said one of the strategies they use to enhance their bond rating is the purchase of bond insurance. The problem with bond insurance is very expensive. So what local cities will oftentimes do is they will join together into a bond pool, and they will buy insurance together, pool their resources together in order to get the best insurance rates possible. That's economies of scale. Economies of scale argues toward more centralization of decision making. So correspondence argues for decentralization, subsidiarity argues for devolution of power and resources. Economies of scale argues in the opposite direction, argues for the efficiencies that we get from more centralization. Well, the question we've always been asking throughout this entire course together is the so what question. Okay, well, two of these argue for decentralization, devolution. One of these principles argues for centralization. Well, so what? The answer to the so what question is that it makes our system of federalism somewhat fluid and dynamic and at times confusing, because we have some forces that pull us in the direction of centralization and national government influence, and other times we have other forces that pull us in the opposite direction toward more decentralization and more state and local deference. So this tension between, between centralization and decentralization really does mark the entire history of our system of federalism in intergovernmental relations. And before we get into some of the specific parts of our Constitution that argue either for centralization or decentralization, let's be sure to point out the difference between what we talk about with federalism and intergovernmental relations. When I was in graduate school back in the Stone Ages, the course I took was called a federalism course. Today, that same course that we offer in our program here at Long Beach is called intergovernmental relations. And the big difference is, in federalism, we're talking about the constitutional relationship between national and state governments. Local governments have no protection in the national constitution. So when you are talking about constitutional federalism, you're talking about the inherent relationship between only two levels of government, national and state. However, as we know, because most of us work at the local level, that as our system has developed over the years, local governments have taken on a very prominent role in terms of service delivery and being the street level bureaucrats of interacting directly with citizens. And so local governments are very important. So we've added local governments into the equation. Whenever we add local governments in the equation, we're talking more about intergovernmental relations than we are constitutional federalism. Because the only protection that local governments have from a constitutional basis is from a state constitution. It's an old rule known as Dillon's Rule, named after an Iowa judge from the 1800s. And Judge Dillon promulgated this rule saying that local governments are creatures of the state, meaning that state governments create local governments, they empower local governments, and if they want to, they can destroy those local governments. So all local power emanates from the state and from the state constitution. So when you have local governments involved, it's intergovernmental relations. When you only look at national and state government, then you're looking more at constitutional federalism. But let's go back and look at the Constitution and see what the Constitution has to say about these relationships between different levels of government and what that then means for who funds services, who pays for those types of services, who's in charge of those goods and services. As you know from your 500 class, and you also know from your undergraduate courses in American government, the Constitution really is an amalgam of compromises. In order to get this Constitution ratified, you had Federalists and Anti-Federalists at the Constitutional Convention. You had representatives from large states and representatives from small states. You had representatives from slave states, representatives from non-slave states. And so you had a great variety of opinions. You had some delegates who arrived at the Constitutional Convention merely to amend the Articles of Confederation, just to make whatever amendments were necessary in order to enhance national defense. You had others like James Madison, who came to the Constitutional Convention hoping to get rid of the Articles and replace it with a brand new Constitution that would create a much stronger, more vibrant national government and make the national government the repository of certain types of powers that used to reside with state governments under the old Articles of Confederation. So when you have all these different disagreements across all these very momentous issues, the only way you're going to get agreement on a contract, a constitution, is if you have a series of compromises. So one of the major compromises that's important for our discussion here in budgeting is the compromise between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So the Federalists wanted to have a stronger, more vibrant national government. The Anti-Federalists really believed in states' rights. They really believed that states should remain the repository of many of these powers and many of these duties. So as a result of that, you end up getting some conflicting language in the Constitution. So in Article 6 of the Constitution, we have this thing called the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause says that the Constitution, treaties, and laws of the United States are supreme to the Constitution, laws, and regulations of state governments. That when a state constitution comes into conflict with the national constitution, the Supremacy Clause in Article 6 very clearly says the national constitution, the national law wins out over the state. So that's a very strong proclamation of national power. That's a very strong statement of the position of Federalists like James Madison. But we know that worried a lot of Anti-Federalists, so much so that in order to get the state of New York to ratify the Constitution, we had to immediately amend the Constitution 10 times. It was almost 11, but it only ended up being 10 times in the Bill of Rights. And we know in that Bill of Rights, that 10th and final amendment in the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment, speaks to reserving powers for state governments. That any powers that are not vested in Congress by the Constitution nor prohibited to the states are reserved for the states and or the people. So the 10th Amendment was there to say this national government would not be too powerful, that if we did not give a power to the national government, that any power not given to the national government will then naturally revert back to the state government. So Article 6 says national government is supreme. 10th Amendment says the national government is limited in that it can only do what the Constitution tells it can do, and all those other powers and responsibilities then belong to the states. So right there, you can see the conflict that we have between Article 6 and the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. Look in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution is where we lay out the powers and duties and responsibilities of the U.S. Congress. Remember, this idea of a Congress that we were creating in the Constitution was a relatively novel idea, especially as compared to the Articles of Confederation. In the Articles of Confederation, the word Congress was used more as a meeting. So, like tonight, what we're doing in this class, we're having a Congress of PPA 555. We're having a meeting of PPA 555. So what the Articles of Confederation said is that the United States was really only the United States when the states got together in this meeting known as a Congress. And so what the article said is that every time they used the term United States, except for one, when they said the title of this confederacy will be the United States of America, other than that one reference, every other time that they refer to the United States, it's in lowercase instead of capital, so it's not a proper noun. And the phrase is the United States in Congress assembled. So there really wasn't necessarily a type of Congress like we know it today. There wasn't a permanent institution under the Articles of Confederation. Madison and the Federalists were able to get a much stronger, more permanent Congress built into the new Constitution. And so we build this permanent bicameral Congress with a House and a Senate, a House where representatives are directly elected based upon proportional representation, a Senate based upon equal representation, 2 per state, whereby the senators are selected by state legislatures as opposed to being directly elected by the people. That type of bicameral Congress, again, was a permanent institution that was created under the Constitution. That was a big win for Madison and the Federalists. But in creating this permanent institution of a Congress, we then had to give them certain powers and duties. And that's what we did in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. So in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, we enumerate certain powers for Congress. And whenever you enumerate a power, you are listing that power. So we listed certain specific powers for Congress, things such as Congress could raise an army and navy. Congress could establish post offices. Congress could levy taxation. Congress could coin money. The Senate had the opportunity to provide advice and consent on the appointments by the president. The Senate had the ability to ratify treaties. We've got all these to do. The Congress had the ability to promote the arts and to declare war. Those are all what are called enumerated powers. They are powers that are specifically listed within the domain of Congress. It may sound counterintuitive, but whenever you enumerate powers, whenever you list powers, you are inherently limiting those powers. Because the assumption is, if a power is not listed in the Constitution, then that power does not belong to Congress or the national government. That we're only listing the powers that actually belong to Congress and the national government. So we enumerate powers, we are limiting the power of Congress, which is again a win for the anti-federalists. However, when you get to the end of Article 1, Section 8, you have this thing called the elastic clause, the necessary and proper clause, that says Congress shall make all laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested into it by the Constitution. Meaning that Congress can do everything that is necessary and proper, everything that it needs to do in order to carry out all those powers that were enumerated earlier in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. So you can see the conflict here. The enumeration of powers in Article 1, Section 8 limit the power of Congress and the national government, but yet the elastic clause greatly expands the power of Congress and the national government. Again, that's that conflict you get with the compromises built into the Constitution. Well, again, what's the so what? The so what is the more powers Congress will have, the more powers the national government will have, the more likely it will be the national government responsible for all these different programs and all these different policies, and you would expect the money to flow from Washington down to DC down to state governments. However, the more you assume that the power lies with state governments, then the more you would assume it's a state responsibility, and so therefore the state will be making these decisions, and the state will then be funding these types of programs and these types of policies. So the reason why we argue a lot about which level of government should be preeminent in terms of funding is because of all these compromises and this conflict that's inherently built into the Constitution. Another principle that was built into, if not the Constitution itself, at least the wake of the Constitution, was this principle known as reciprocal tax immunity. So again, the framers, even with this new Constitution, still viewed the new nation as being somewhat of a confederation. We run into some trouble today whenever we try and take our language and what we mean by our words and impose those on the framers. The framers had different meanings for a lot of the words they use as opposed to what those words mean to us today. And one of those words is confederation versus federation. So for us, say, when we think about a confederation, we think about, for instance, the Confederacy and the Civil War. and we think about all these independent sovereign states, that's a confederation. We don't think of ourselves as a confederation today. We think of ourselves as a federation, in that, yes, we have these states that have some sovereignty, but they're all part of the bigger whole. They are all subservient to the national government. That's kind of a federation. The framers called their new government in the Constitution a federation. They called it a federal form of government, but oftentimes they meant more of a confederation. So they really did still have that belief in state sovereignty in many respects in the early years after the adoption, ratification of the Constitution. And that is really seen very well in this principle of reciprocal tax immunity. Reciprocal tax immunity argues that governments are sovereign. And so the national government is sovereign and state governments are sovereign as well. As sovereign entities, you cannot have one level of government that's destroying another level of government. There are some boundaries between those two sovereign entities. So reciprocal tax immunity essentially says that one level of government may not tax the holdings of another level of government, because that would then be a violation of this sovereignty. So the immunity, tax immunity, is reciprocal. It goes both ways between national and state governments. We don't include local governments in that because, again, they're still creatures of the state. So the state can decide what it wants to do with its local governments. But we're talking about the relationship between national and state governments. This idea of reciprocal tax immunity, and we had mentioned this in an earlier class, was first promulgated by Chief Justice Marshall in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland. I remember our discussion from when we talked about debt. We talked about McCulloch versus Maryland. Congress had established a second bank of the United States, which had essentially a branch office in Baltimore, Maryland. Problem was, the state of Maryland had a law whereby it would tax the fiscal notes issued by that second bank of the United States branch office in Baltimore, Maryland. So you had the state of Maryland taxing a federal entity, a national entity, the second bank of the United States. The case, McCulloch versus Maryland, went to the Supreme Court, and Chief Justice Marshall said the power to tax is equivalent to the power to destroy. So if we allow the state of Maryland to tax the national government, that's equivalent to allowing the state of Maryland to destroy the national government and vice versa. Creates this idea of reciprocal tax immunity. That's why today, if you have a state university, state property, that's located within a local city jurisdiction, that city cannot apply its property tax rate to the value of the property held by the state government. That's kind of that idea of reciprocal tax immunity. Now, if the state would want to allow local governments to do that, it could do that because it's state and local, but that's kind of the idea of having this immunity between different levels of government. Similarly, if you have a federal military installation in the state of California, the state of California cannot tax the property owned by the federal government in that federal military installation. Reciprocal tax immunity, as it was created in 1819, was with us for many, many years. It was a basic principle of intergovernmental fiscal relations. Then, as we had talked about in the previous class, in 1986, we had this big piece of legislation called the Tax Reform Act. And the Tax Reform Act created these two different categories of debt, public activity and private activity debt. Private activity debt may be subject to taxation, but the interest earned on the debt could be subject to taxation. So what the national government, what Congress did in 1986, is it said we can tax debt that is issued by municipalities, depending on what type of debt it is. State and local finance officers were concerned about that, so they took a case all the way up to the Supreme Court in 1988 in South Carolina versus Baker. And it was in South Carolina versus Baker that the Supreme Court essentially got rid of reciprocal tax immunity and said if Congress decides that it wants to apply federal income taxation to the debt that's being issued by state and local governments, the ball is in its court. It has the power to do so. So this whole idea of reciprocal tax immunity as a constitutional principle kind of went away with South Carolina versus Baker. Now, the national government still abides by it, and so you still kind of have the principle in practice, but if Congress ever decides it wants to get rid of reciprocal tax immunity, Supreme Court has said Congress has the constitutional ability to do so. But usually we have a respect between different levels of government. And so usually when it comes to revenue, we have a lot of what we call source separation, where we will separate revenue sources according to different levels of government. So the national government is almost entirely reliant upon an income tax. State governments are usually not entirely reliant upon an income tax because they don't want to step on the toes of the national government. And so therefore they supplement a lot of their tax revenue with sales taxes. Property taxes tend to be the primary domain of local governments, so they don't, again, tread on state or federal government by charging the same types of taxes. And so that type of source separation is an artifact that is left over from this constitutional principle of reciprocal tax immunity. So let's get into some of the specifics. Now we've kind of got the constitutional underpinnings taken care of. We kind of have the principles in mind about, the principles that underpin intergovernmental fiscal relations. Let's get into some of the practical tools that are used in the world of intergovernmental fiscal relations. Obviously, the tool that has the most profound impact upon state and local finances will be the use of grants in aid. And not all grants are treated equally. So in a grant in aid, the federal government will provide grant money to the state government to engage in some type of activity, to engage in some type of behavior, typically to try and help achieve some objective that was established at the national level of government. The way the national government does that, though, will depend upon what they're trying to achieve and the type of tool they want to use. So there are different tools, different types of grants that can be used for different purposes by the grantor, by the national government, for instance. So some of you may work with these grants on a daily basis, so you're familiar with these different types of grants, but the polar opposites of grants are categorical grants and what's called general revenue sharing. So at the one end of the spectrum, you have what are called categorical grants. Categorical grants are very specific grants of money from one level of government to another to accomplish a very specific goal or objective. So the national government will use a categorical grant oftentimes if it has a specific national objective and it wants to incentivize state and local governments to work toward achieving that national objective. That's when they'll tend to use a categorical grant. Because categorical grants are very specific. Categorical grants come with strings attached in that the recipient, the state or the local government, will need to report on a frequent basis in terms of how this grant money is being used, so the national government can make sure the grant money is being used in the way in which the national government wants it used, that the money is being used to achieve this national goal or this national objective. Yet an example of that in education spending would be your Title I money. And so Title I money comes from the national government to local school districts. It must be used in these specific schools on these specific programs for these specific students. So a lot of specificity and a lot of reporting requirements. So categorical grants is a great tool for the national government to use if it wants to hold the recipient, state or local government, accountable for how the money is being spent. The opposite end of the spectrum is what was known as revenue sharing. And back in the Nixon administration, when Nixon came into the White House, Nixon was a firm believer in decentralization, devolution. In fact, he was known for what were called the 3 Ds of Nixon federalism: decentralization, devolution, and deregulation. Decentralized decision-making to allow state and local governments to participate in the decisions that are actually affecting them, correspondence principle. Devolution, to provide resources to state and local governments so that they can carry out the types of decisions they want to carry out, subsidiarity. And then deregulation, to remove some of these very strict limitations and regulations that were placed upon not only state and local governments, but also placed upon businesses as well. So through decentralization, devolution, deregulation, Nixon wanted to try and shift the balance of power from the national government to state and local governments. Nixon believed that who knows best what's in the best interests of citizens than governments that are located in a closer proximity to those citizens, obviously state and local governments. So what he introduced as part of his 3Ds of federalism was a program called General Revenue Sharing. General revenue sharing is where the national government would literally turn over a percentage of federal income tax revenue over to state and local governments with very few, if no strings attached. So here's a percentage of federal income tax revenue. State and local governments, you can use that money how you see fit to help your citizens and to accomplish your policy goals and your policy objectives. So you can see it's completely diametrically opposed from categorical grants. Categorical grants, a lot of oversight, very little flexibility for the recipient. General revenue sharing, very little oversight, a great deal of flexibility for the recipients of that grant money. Then in between, in that gray area in between, you have block grants. Block grants afford more flexibility to recipients than categorical grants, but they have more reporting requirements than general revenue sharing did. And I should mention, general revenue sharing at the federal level is no longer still around. When Ronald Reagan came into office in the 1980s, he believed in general revenue sharing. He believed in Nixon's 3Ds of federalism, but the problem was there just was not any revenue to share. So from the time that Nixon established general revenue sharing until 1986, when the Reagan administration got rid of it, we were running deficits every single year. And every year the federal budget deficit was getting larger and larger and larger. So not only did we not have a lot of money to share, we had less and less of it to share every subsequent year. So just for practical reasons, not ideological reasons, Reagan got rid of general revenue sharing. So there's no longer that general revenue sharing as a funding mechanism at the federal level. But these block grants, again, are kind of that happy medium between categorical grants and general revenue sharing. Block grants are still in use today. And not to talk too much about years ago, the Reagan administration, but again, a very important thing the Reagan administration did is it took 187 categorical grant programs and it combined them together into only 13 block grant programs. And it did that to, again, try and give more flexibility to state and local governments as the recipients of these federal monies. The problem was that there's a trade-off. And so as a state and local government, these new block grants that were created out of all those existing categorical grants, you would get more flexibility in determining how to spend the money, but you would also get less money. And so they took some funding away in order to try and help balance the budget. But today, with our types of grants, we typically tend to see categorical and block grants. Now, within categorical and block grants, there are also two other features of grants that we can use to differentiate them from each other. Some of these grants are what are called project-based grants. I'll put this in text chat. And some of them are formula-based grants. So in a project-based grant, the federal government will put out a request for grant proposals. So they'll put out an RFP, and that RFP will say, X amount of money is going to be awarded to grant recipients for a proposal that will meet all these different requirements. So your potential recipient will then go and put together a grant proposal, will send that grant proposal off to the federal government. Your grant proposal will compete against another city's grant proposal. Federal government will review all those grant proposals and then will pick its most preferred grant proposals, and those grant proposals are the ones that then get funded. It's a project-based type of grant. The nice thing about project-based types of grants is it allows the potential recipient to pick and choose which programs they want to apply for. So at least in theory, if this grant money is going to fund a project that they don't care about, that won't benefit their community, they just won't write a proposal and they just won't pursue those dollars. So that's a good thing about project-based grant. The downside of a project-based grant is that sometimes it creates this thing known as grantsmanship, in that local governments will just be pursuing the money. They'll say, here's all this free federal money, let's go out there and get as much free federal money as we can get. So they just write grant proposals for all these different programs. And so any type of proposal comes out, they write a grant for it. So they hire professional grant writers to try and get them as much federal money as they can. You put a lot of your resources then toward chasing these grants as opposed to putting your resources toward delivering services to your population. That's what's called a project-based grant. Then there are what are known as formula-based grants. A lot of education funding is done through formula-based grants. We'll create a formula. We'll then take the characteristics of an individual potential recipient, a local city or school district. We'll plug their characteristics into the formula, work through the formula to see who gets the grant money and how much money they get. So in terms of the base grant that school districts get from the state of California, you look at things such as their percentage of at-risk students that they have in the district. You look at their property tax capacity, their assessed valuation of property tax, their ability to generate tax revenue on their own. And you go through all these different calculations, cost of doing business calculation. You put all these different variables in your formula, and then you determine how much each school district gets in its base grant, which is its unrestricted funding, based upon how well they fare in this formula. So you can get out these grants either on a project basis or on a formula basis. You can also give these grants out either with or without what are called matching components. So the federal government may really have the vested interest in this certain program or this certain policy. It really will help us accomplish a national goal or objective. So the federal government decides to put its money where its mouth is, and will say, state and local governments, we will match every dollar you raise, dollar for dollar, up to a certain amount in order to fund this project. Well, what that does then is, yes, it provides some free, quote unquote, free money to local governments, but it also has potential to distort local preferences. Because again, you go back to the example we used in our debt management discussion. If you have a city that's deciding whether to build a recreation center or a senior citizen center, and they're going to do their cost benefit analysis, and if the benefit cost ratio for the rec center is 1.3, the benefit cost ratio for the senior center is 1.1, they're probably going to pursue the recreation center because it has a better benefit cost ratio. Then along comes the federal government and says, here's some free federal money. That immediately reduces the cost of the recreation of the projects. And so let's say they come and say, we want you to do the senior center instead of the recreation center. They throw some money toward the local government and say, for every dollar that you raise, we'll match it with federal dollars up to $25 million. Well, that then reduces the amount of cost for the senior center, which reduces the denominator of your benefit cost ratio, which will then create a bigger benefit cost ratio. And suddenly that BCR may end up being 1.5 or 1.6 instead of 1.1. And now it's distorted the preferences toward the senior center. Maybe citizens want and need the rec center more, but the benefit cost ratio for the senior center looks a heck of a lot better than it does now for the recreation center. So you get a lot of this distortion of local preferences whenever you have a matching component built into these federal grants. But again, the type of grant the federal government's going to use will depend upon what they're trying to accomplish. How much control do they need over what state and local governments are doing to accomplish those national objectives? There's a whole wealth of literature in the finance literature looking at why we have intergovernmental grants. And if there are political reasons, if there are practical reasons, we know that there are political reasons for a lot of these intergovernmental grants, especially for categorical grants. The way in which Congress works is really predisposed toward categorical grants, especially if you think about the House of Representatives. In the House of Representatives, you have all of these representatives who are representing their individual congressional districts. They want to get reelected. In order to get reelected, they have to show their constituents that they are making accomplishments. It's what's called credit claiming. So they have to claim credit for things. So they claim credit for things such as bridges and jobs that they're able to bring back into their jurisdiction. What that means is you have a lot of what's called log rolling, where it's kind of the quid pro quo of you scratch my back, I scratch your back. You vote for my piece of legislation, I'll vote for your piece of legislation. And so because of the specificity of all these different goals of individual members of Congress, it kind of leads to specific types of grants, such as categorical grants. And so there's a political explanation for why we end up getting these types of grants. There's also some practical explanation as well, in terms of oftentimes these federal grants are very politically popular types of grants. And so even if the state government doesn't want to take the money, the state government doesn't want to spend the money on what the national government wants it to spend it on, if it's a politically popular type of program, it becomes really difficult for state governments to object to that type of federal money. Obviously, state and local governments would prefer block grants as long as they still get as much money as they would have gotten under a categorical grant. But the bittersweet pill for state and local governments to swallow is that it's oftentimes a mutually exclusive situation, that the more flexibility they're given, the less money they get. The more money they get, the less flexibility that they get. And so those two variables oftentimes work in inverse of each other. But getting these intergovernmental grants obviously will be important for a local government to diversify its revenue portfolio, but you never want to become too reliant upon intergovernmental grants because they're very temporary and you're not 100% sure you're going to get them in the future. But grants have a direct impact, obviously, on the finances of state and local governments. But there is a second tool used by the national government that also has an impact upon state and local government finance. It's just a little bit more of an indirect impact, and those are mandates. So you can think of grants and mandates as kind of the carrot and the stick approach. So the national government wants state and local governments to help achieve a national objective. So they incentivize it by giving them grant money. They give them the carrot, and that's kind of a warm and fuzzy way of getting state and local governments to achieve national objectives. When the carrot approach doesn't work, then you bring out the stick approach, which is the use of a mandate. A mandate is an order. So the national government comes in and orders a state or local government to do something. They are issuing a mandate. State governments complain all the time about national mandates, how they're unfair, how they violate the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. But even though they complain about the unfairness of national mandates, that does not stop states from imposing mandates upon their local governments. So it's kind of a hypocritical situation. They hate mandates when they get them from the federal government, but they love them when they can push them off to local governments. So mandates are the stick approach that you can use to strongly incentivize through a punitive measure getting state and local governments to buy into national government objectives. Not all mandates are created equal, and not all mandates are funded equally either. There are four main categories of mandates that we tend to see used in American federalism. The first type of mandate is a direct order mandate. In a direct order mandate, the national government will tell a state or local government, you must do this. You must take this action under threat of either criminal or civil penalty. So you have no choice, you must do this. That's a very direct mandate, obviously. It's something the national government uses when it can. The problem is that sometimes the national government doesn't have the constitutional basis to issue a direct order mandate. So when they can constitutionally do it, they will. If they don't have the constitutional ability to do it, that's when they use another type of mandate, one of these other three different types of mandates. So when they don't have the constitutional ability to just tell a state or local government to do something and issue this direct order mandate, they have to use something else. A second type of mandate is what's called a cross-cutting mandate. Cross-cutting mandates cut across several different policy areas. So the best example of this is anti-discrimination. You may not discriminate in the areas of elections or housing or employment. You can't discriminate across all these different policy areas. It cuts across all those policy areas. Hence the reason why it's called a cross-cutting type of mandate. Third type of mandate is what's called a crossover mandate. And this is a mandate that's used when you can't use a direct order mandate. So if you don't have the constitutional ability to order a state or local government to do something, You then compel them to do it through a crossover mandate. In a crossover mandate, you get a state or local government to do something in one policy area by taking money away from them in another policy area. So you want state governments to do something about, highway safety. So you want, like in the Clinton administration, you wanted to have a 0.08 blood alcohol content level, or the BAC level. So the blood alcohol content, the BAC level, is for drunk driving. And so the Clinton administration wanted every state to have a 0.08 blood alcohol content level. There is nothing in the national constitution that empowers the president or Congress to tell state governments that they must adopt a 0.08 blood alcohol content level. The technology didn't exist when the Constitution was developed. So the national government has come up with a more innovative way of inducing state governments to adopt a 0.08 blood alcohol content level. Because at that time, in the Clinton administration, different states had different levels. Some states were 0.08, some were 0.10, some were 0.12, some were 0.14. The administration would have everyone 0.08. So what they say is, until you adopt a state law that requires a 0.08 blood alcohol content level, we are going to remove federal transportation money from you. So you will lose your federal transportation money, what was called the old ICE-T, the Intermodal Surface Transportation and Efficiency Act, which is now the Intermodal Surface Transportation Equity Act. Will take that federal transportation money away from you. They did the same thing, not the Clinton administration, but years earlier, Washington did the same thing with speed limits, where we want a national speed limit of 55 miles per hour. So states, until you adopt the 55 mile per hour speed limit, you're going to lose federal highway funds. Highway Beautification Act, all the way back in the 1950s, used crossover mandates. We're going to beautify our highways, and so we're going to put limitations on the number of billboards and the proximity of billboards to highways. If you don't abide by these federal standards, we can't tell you where to put your billboard, but if you don't do what we want you to do, again, we'll take federal transportation money away from you. So that's a crossover mandate, oftentimes seen as being very insidious by state and local governments, because if you don't do what we want you to do here, we're going to take federal money away from you over here. And you can see how it's a very useful tool for the federal government when the federal government is unable constitutionally to just simply use a direct order mandate and just simply tell state and local governments, you must take this action. Then the fourth type of mandate is what's called a preemptive mandate. And preemptive mandates come in two different varieties. There are fully preemptive mandates and there are partially preemptive mandates. In a fully preemptive mandate, the national government will come in and tell a state or local government, you no longer have the legal authority to make a decision in this policy area. That legally, you're not allowed to make these decisions anymore. An example of that was in the world of internet sales taxation. So years ago, there were 10 states that had a state law in the books that would tax the amount of money that you paid monthly to your internet service provider in order to get access to the internet. So that monthly fee you pay your internet service provider would then be subject to a state internet access tax. Several years ago, Congress decided there will no longer be any state internet access taxes and passed a fully preemptive mandate saying that state governments, you may no longer have a internet access tax, period, end of story. So I think it was by January of 2007, all those internet access taxes went off the books because the federal government said, you can't do it anymore. That's a fully preemptive type of mandate. National government stepping in and preempting your legal authority to make a decision in that policy area. What's much more common, though, is a second type of preemptive mandate, which is a partially preemptive mandate, because we see these all the time in environmental regulation and protection, where the national government will come in and will say, here is the minimum air quality standard that all states must have. Here's the minimum water quality standard that all states must have. States, you are allowed to go above that if you like. You can be more restrictive if you would like to, but you cannot be less restrictive. So here in the state of California, we have air and water quality standards that are more restrictive than this basic national minimum standard. We can do that because we're free to be more restrictive, but we are preempted from being less restrictive. We have to at least have a standard as strict as what the national government tells us to do. If you remember back in the last administration, the Trump administration was going to take federal grant money away from the state of California because the state of California had stricter air and water quality standards than what the national minimum standard was. And the administration wanted California to lower its standards to the national standard, or else it would take money away from them if they didn't do that. But it's called partially preempted because, again, up to the national standard, you are free to make whatever decisions you want. You're not free to make decisions you want. You have to abide by the national standard. Once you get above that national standard, that's when you then have the flexibility, and that's when you are then free to have stricter standards. But below the national standard, you have no flexibility. You are fully preempted below the national standard, but you are not preempted above the national standard. So you can kind of see how a partially preempted mandate really fits well with environmental regulation and environmental protection. So the national government will use different types of mandates depending upon what the national government is trying to accomplish and how much they believe state and local governments are going to be on board in supporting these national goals and these national objectives. The less supportive they think a state or local government is going to be, the more restrictive approach they're probably going to use. They're probably going to use a mandate as opposed to a grant. If they are going to use a grant, they're going to probably use a categorical grant as opposed to a block grant. But the subsidiarity problem comes into play, obviously, when, regardless of what type of mandate is being used, when those mandates are not fully funded, that creates a major problem for state and local budgeting, because that will blow a huge hole in a state or local budget if they're required to take a certain action and there's no federal money to support that action that they are taking. So obviously, state and local governments fight very hard to get all federal mandates to be hopefully fully funded, and not fully funded, at least partially funded. Local governments fight very hard against the state government to try and get all those state mandates to be either fully or partially funded. For years, the National League of Cities, the NLC, tried to bring awareness to the issue of partially and unfunded mandates through a National Unfunded Mandates Day. And actually, someone who I went to graduate school with, her job at the National League of Cities was to organize this National Day of Unfunded Mandates, where in every major city, you would have these protests against unfunded and partially funded mandates. It was successful enough that in 1996, we got a piece of legislation through Congress called the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. And the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act placed a limitation on the ability of Congress to pass these mandates without at least attaching some federal money to them. What the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act would do is it would require that if a proposed piece of legislation would cost state and local governments above a certain threshold, that Congress would then have to do a study to see exactly how much that mandate would cost. If that mandate cost too much and exceeded that threshold, then Congress was statutorily required to at least provide some partial funding for what they're requiring state and local governments to do. So rhetorically, it was a success for state and local governments because it did put this limitation on the use of unfunded mandates. The problem was the way in which the legislation was designed. Number one, the legislation was designed to not occur automatically. So a piece of legislation is being discussed in the House of Representatives, for example. It goes to the floor for debate. In order for the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act to come into play, a member would have to stand up and rise to a point of order and say, Madam Speaker, I rise to a point of order that this piece of legislation violates the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. Once that happens, then Congress must go and conduct a study to see how much it's actually going to cost, and then all the provisions of the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act start to come into play. But only if a member rises to a point of order. If no one rises to a point of order, and everyone just sits there quietly, then the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act does not come into play. So it has to be something done proactively by a member of Congress. The second problem with the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act is it affects mandates moving forward, from 1996 moving forward. All those mandates that had been passed prior to 1996 were grandfathered out of the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. So it didn't fix all those existing mandates. It just looked at trying to partially fix new mandates that were going forward. So the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act was a good rhetorical victory for state and local governments, but from a practical perspective, it really hasn't stopped the adoption of unfunded or partially funded mandates by Congress. All it has done is it slowed down their implementation. Because what Congress found is they found a loophole. That, okay, let's say that the threshold, I don't know what the threshold is now, but back in 1996, the threshold was $50 million. So this piece of legislation is going to cost states more than $50 million. Then it was subject to the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. What Congress found is that, well, that's $50 million in one given year. However, if we gradually implement it over 10 years, that's only $5 million per year, well under the $50 million threshold cap for the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. So they would just gradually implement it over 10 years. Or if you did it over 5 years, it's only $10 million a year. They would do whatever they needed to do to get it under that $50 million threshold. So it did not stop the passage of these mandates, it just slowed down their implementation. At the state level, we also have Unfunded Mandates Reform Acts. Here in California, we have what's called Proposition 1A. And again, in California, like we said last week, we always reuse proposition numbers, which makes things really confusing. But we've used Proposition 1A multiple times. But this Proposition 1A was an Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, which said that the governor and state legislature could not pass on unfunded mandates to local governments unless, and the big caveat here was, unless it was a state of fiscal exigency or emergency as declared by either the governor or the state legislature. So either the governor or the state legislature could say, you know what, we're in a fiscal emergency, we need to do this, and as long as they say they need to do it, then they're allowed to do it. So it's a loophole the size of a semi-truck that you can drive through so that the state can still impose unfunded and partially funded mandates onto local governments. Now, that declaration of fiscal emergency couldn't happen every single year. So you can only do, I think it was 3 out of 5 years. So there's a limitation on how often you can do it, but state government did it. They don't need to do it now because the state budget is in such a healthy condition, but back in the fiscal crisis, they were able to say fiscal emergency, and then they started reinstituting these unfunded and partially funded mandates. Unfunded and partially funded mandates violate the subsidiarity principle and again have major implications for budgeting at the state and the local level. So again, I think the rule of thumb and the moral of the story here with intergovernmental fiscal relations is that there is no clear answer in terms of which level of government should have responsibility for funding policies and programs. It's a very contextual type of a situation where we look at the issue itself, the context of the situation. We look at what the Supreme Court has said about Congress's ability to issue these types of mandates, and whether or not it's the national government doing it or state government will depend upon the issue, will depend upon the period of time we're talking about with judicial interpretation. We have seen some situations where the Supreme Court has stepped in and said, no, this is not a proper use of national power. There's an example back with the Brady Bill, for instance, where in the Brady Bill, there was a requirement that local public safety officers, local sheriff's departments, and local police departments had to do background checks for the purchases of firearms, and that local agency had to pay for those background checks. That was then challenged, went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, at least at that time, said, we're not going to allow that. We're not going to allow that because there's not a clear enough connection between Congress requiring local governments to pay for background checks and the Commerce Clause, the ability of Congress to regulate interstate commerce. And what the Supreme Court said is if Congress is going to tell a state or local government to do something under the Commerce Clause, there must be a very clear linkage between what Congress is telling the state and local government to do and interstate commerce. If there's not that clear linkage, then Congress isn't allowed to issue that type of an unfunded or partially funded mandate. But again, even when states have had some limited success pushing back on these national unfunded and partially funded mandates, they still have no reservations about placing these same types of unfunded and partially funded mandates on their local governments. And whenever you get unfunded and partially funded mandates placed upon you, that is outside of your control. Voters will still hold you accountable for the fiscal problems you're having as a result of those partially unfunded mandates, but it's beyond your control because these are mandates that are rolling down the federalism hill from upper level governments. And again, the old adage in federalism is everything rolls downhill in federalism with the exception of money. So the money doesn't come, we still violate routinely the subsidiarity principle in the way in which we do federalism here in the US. And again, intergovernmental fiscal revenue can be a very important part of the revenue diversity of your portfolio, but you also have to be very careful knowing that, number one, that grant money is not forever, and so you can't supplant your own source revenue with that grant money. And number two, you don't just get grants, you also get these unfunded and partially funded mandates. So the good also comes with the bad with intergovernmental fiscal relationships. So that is our discussion of intergovernmental fiscal relations. Again, if this is something that you're interested in, the PPA 535 class will get into it in a lot more depth. We spend a week just really going into a lot of the details on these different types of grants and giving you examples of categorical and block grants and where they came from and why they are used and how they are used and have been used by the federal government in the past. But this is kind of, again, tip of the iceberg to show you that other part of the revenue portfolio that most local governments have. Either they benefit from, and in some ways they are hurt by. So any questions on grants, mandates, intergovernmental fiscal relations, or intergovernmental fiscal revenue? We usually talk about revenue collection as well, but that was kind of subsumed in our discussion of taxation. We talked about collection and collectability of different revenue sources. And so don't really want to repeat that because that was subsumed within our previous discussion of taxation. Okay, if not, I told you this would be a short night for us. So that wraps up all of our substantive information for our term. Again, you have Beach Board essay number 5 that's due on Monday, and then you have your final assessment that's due on Tuesday. For your answers on the final assessment, again, just they can be very brief, very parsimonious, a paragraph or two for each one of the questions, and that certainly will be enough to get the job done. That will then come in by midnight next Tuesday. I'll do the grading, and then we will all be done for this course. Alrighty? Okay, if you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out to me, shoot me an email. Otherwise, I look forward to reading your posts as well as your final assessments and getting your grades all wrapped up so you can move onward and upward in the program. So thanks, everyone. Have a great week, and I will get your final grades up next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.